He had never heard of Ajala until he was posted there for his National Youth Service. Fresh out of university, he was filled with hope and enthusiasm, ready to contribute to a community that he hoped would welcome him warmly. But when he alighted from the bus at the edge of the village, there was an eerie silence, and a strange aura seemed to hover in the air. As he waited for a taxi to take him deeper into Ajala, he noticed the villagers casting furtive glances at him from a distance, whispering to each other and making strange gestures. A taxi pulled over, and the grim-faced driver looked at us with curiosity before reluctantly agreeing to take him to his destination. As he placed his luggage in the trunk, he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. He tried to make small talk with the two other passengers in the car, but they remained silent, as if unwilling to speak of anything that concerned Ajala. The village, they said, was not for the faint-hearted. After the unsettling ride to Ajala, Is was relieved to find two other corpers at the lodge, Beo and Chinidu. Beo was tall and had a calm demeanor, while Chinidu was shorter and more energetic. They greeted Is warmly, their smiles easing some of the tension that had built up within him. The three of them sat together on the porch of the dilapidated lodge, exchanging stories about their university days and their expectations for the service year. Despite the camaraderie, there was a lingering fear beneath the surface. Beo and Chinidu seemed hesitant whenever Is brought up the topic of Ajala and the locals. They shared stories they had heard, rumors of strange happenings, disappearances, and rituals. As the sun set, their laughter grew quieter, and the shadows grew longer, as if the village itself was swallowing the daylight. Is felt a shiver run down his spine as Beo finally muttered, "We just have to get through this year in one piece." The Corpers Lodge stood isolated at the edge of the village, surrounded by a wild and overgrown forest. The building was old, with cracked walls and broken windows that let the chilly night breeze enter at will. When the local guide brought them to the lodge, he had smiled, an eerie grin that revealed more of his discomfort than friendliness. "This is where you'll stay," he had said, his voice hollow. Is, Beo, and Chinidu took a good look around the lodge and exchanged nervous glances. The lodge was nothing like they had imagined, a neglected structure that looked unfit for living. Inside, they found dusty furniture, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and stains on the walls that seemed suspiciously like old blood. Chinidu tried to make light of the situation, cracking a joke about their luxury residence, but his forced laughter soon died down as they all took in their new surroundings. It was clear they would need to make do with the place, despite the creeping feeling that they were not alone. That night, sleep eluded the young Corpers. They lay on their mattresses, which were no more than thin pieces of foam placed on the bare, cold floor. Outside, the wind howled, rustling the branches of nearby trees and creating strange shadows that danced on the walls of their room. He tried to keep his thoughts positive, but the atmosphere was suffocating. Every little creak and groan of the old building seemed to signal impending danger. Suddenly, there was a knock at the window. The sound cut through the silence, freezing Is in place. He held his breath, straining his ears to make sure it wasn't his imagination. Another knock came, followed by a little girl's voice. "By jollof rice," she said, her voice carrying an unsettling cheerfulness. Beo and Chinidu sat up, their eyes wide with fear. Is felt his heart pounding as the knocking continued, relentless and chilling. For the next 20 minutes, they sat in silence, clinging to each other, until the knocking finally ceased, leaving them drenched in sweat, their bodies trembling. The following morning, the three friends decided they needed to find out more about Ajala. They couldn't stay in such a place without knowing the full story behind the strange occurrences they had experienced. Their first step was to go to the secretariat and talk to the state coordinator. The road to the secretariat took them through the heart of Ajala, past homes with doors tightly shut and eyes peeking through curtains. They noticed how the villagers seemed to avoid them, whispering to each other and making strange hand signals as they walked past. On their way, they met an old woman carrying a basket of vegetables. She eyed them curiously when they asked for directions, then pointed them towards a path that passed by an old cemetery. "Follow that path. You'll find the secretariat beyond it," she said, her voice laced with something that sounded like pity. As they approached the cemetery, Is felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Gravestones stood crooked and weathered, some covered in moss, others broken. The air grew cold, and the three young men exchanged worried looks. Beo sighed. "I really don't like this place," he whispered. The state coordinator's office was a small building at the end of the cemetery path. When Beo and Chinedu arrived, they explained their predicament to the coordinator, a stern-looking man who seemed uninterested in their fears. He listened to their story, nodding slowly, but when he asked if they could be relocated, the coordinator shook his head. "I'm afraid that's not possible right now," he said. "I can only consider relocation after 3 months." 3 months? Chinedu exclaimed, his voice rising in frustration. "Sir, you don't understand. There is something wrong with this village. We can't stay here for 3 months." The coordinator sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Look, you're not the first to face difficulties here, and you won't be the last. Ajala has its peculiarities. But as long as you do your duties and stay within certain boundaries, you'll be fine." He didn't elaborate on what those boundaries were, leaving the young men more confused and frightened than before. On their way back from the coordinator's office, the trio was forced to walk through the cemetery again. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the graves, and the chill in the air seemed even colder than before. As they approached the path, Beo paused, staring at one particular grave. It was adorned with cowries and strange carvings, unlike the others. He pointed it out to Iz, who shivered as he examined it. The name on the grave was Iniola, and there was something about it that made them uneasy. Suddenly, Chinedu heard something, a soft whisper coming from somewhere among the graves. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously. They all froze, straining their ears. There it was again, a whisper, almost like someone calling a name. They turned and hurried away, their footsteps quickening as the whispers grew louder, as if the graves themselves were coming alive. By the time they reached the lodge, they were breathless, and their faces were pale. "What was that?" Beo asked, but no one had an answer. As night fell, Beo and Chinedu decided it would be safer to stay indoors. They locked the doors, made sure the windows were secure, and sat in silence. They were just beginning to relax when they heard a noise outside, a rustling sound, like someone moving through the bushes. They exchanged nervous glances, and he slowly approached the window, peeking through the small opening. In the dim light of the moon, he saw a woman in a flowing white gown, her hair loose and wild, walking down the path leading to their lodge. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide and vacant. She walked slowly, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as if she were in a trance. Iz's breath caught in his throat, and he backed away from the window. "What did you see?" Beo whispered. He swallowed hard. "There's a woman, she's just walking around out there." The three of them huddled together, the fear palpable. They watched as the woman walked past the lodge without turning her head, disappearing into the darkness. It was as if she hadn't noticed them at all, and yet, her presence left a mark, a reminder of how strange Ajala truly was. The following day, 2 new corpers arrived at the lodge, Nnamdi and Sola. They seemed more confident than Iz and his friends, laughing and joking about how they would make the best of their time in Ajala. Nnamdi was a tall, muscular man with a commanding presence, while Sola was smaller but equally charismatic. They listened with amusement as Iz, Beo, and Chinedu narrated the events of the past few days. "Come on, it's just a village," Nnamdi said with a dismissive wave. "All these stories are just superstitions meant to scare newcomers." Sola nodded in agreement, adding, "We'll be fine. Nothing to worry about." Their confidence was contagious, and for a while, the others began to feel like maybe they had just been overreacting. Maybe Ajala wasn't as sinister as they had thought. But deep down, Iz knew that something was still very wrong. He had seen the fear in the villagers' eyes, the hesitation in the coordinator's voice. There was a darkness in Ajala that no amount of bravado could dispel. That evening, Nnamdi and Sola took it upon themselves to cook dinner. They made a big pot of jollof rice, and everyone gathered in the main room to eat. The atmosphere was relaxed for the first time since Iz had arrived in Ajala. Laughter filled the room as they shared stories of their university days, teasing each other over their past embarrassments. The aroma of the jollof rice filled the room, and they eagerly dug into their plates. But as he took his first bite, something caught his eye, a small mark on one of the pieces of meat. He paused, examining it closely. It looked like a birthmark, shaped like a tiny cross. His stomach churned as a memory flashed in his mind. There, one of the young men they had met on their first day in Ajala, had a similar mark on his thigh. Isa's hands began to tremble, and he quickly put his plate down. "What's wrong?" Chinedu asked, noticing Isa's sudden change in demeanor. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. I think I need some fresh air," he said, standing up abruptly and leaving the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening, something that was beyond their understanding. The laughter from the dining room soon died down as the coppers settled in for the night. The exhaustion of the day had finally caught up with them, and one by one, they fell asleep. All except Is, who lay in his bed, his mind racing. He couldn't forget the mark on the meat, the resemblance it bore to theirs birthmark. He knew he needed to share his fears with the others, but he didn't want to sound crazy. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the lodge. Is bolted upright, his heart pounding in his chest. The knock was followed by another, and another, an urgent, desperate banging. Is glanced at the others, who were still asleep, oblivious to the noise. Slowly, he got out of bed and approached the door. The banging grew louder as he drew closer, and he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who is it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. There was no response, only more banging, now accompanied by the soft sound of a child crying. He felt his legs go weak, and he backed away from the door, his whole body shaking with fear. The crying continued, growing louder and more insistent, until suddenly, it stopped. He stood in the darkness, the silence pressing in on him. He knew that whatever was outside the door was not human, and he prayed that it wouldn't return. When the morning sun finally broke through the small, grimy windows of the lodge, he felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He hadn't slept a wink, haunted by the events of the previous night. As the others began to wake up, he sat quietly, staring at the door, half expecting to see it covered in blood or strange symbols. But there was nothing, no trace of the mysterious knocking or the crying that had terrified him. Bill yawned and stretched, glancing over at Is. "You look like you didn't sleep at all," he commented, frowning slightly. Is nodded, his face pale. "Something happened last night. There was a knock on the door, someone was crying. I think we need to leave this place." The room went silent as the others processed his words. Namdi chuckled dismissively. "You probably just had a nightmare, man. This place is creepy, sure, but we can't start panicking over every sound we hear." Sola, however, seemed less confident. "Is isn't the type to make up stories," she said softly. "Maybe there's something more going on here." Is looked at her gratefully, glad that at least one person took his fears seriously. The rest of the group exchanged uncertain glances, and eventually, Bill suggested they take a walk around the village to clear their heads. They needed to stay busy, to avoid giving in to the creeping sense of dread that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. The group decided to take Bill's suggestion and set out for a walk through Ajala. It was a bright morning, and they hoped the sunlight would make the village seem less menacing. As they walked down the narrow, dusty paths, the villagers watched them with suspicious eyes, whispering to one another as the coppers passed by. They noticed that many of the villagers carried charms or amulets, small items that looked like they had been made from bones, feathers, or pieces of cloth. Chinedu tried to strike up a conversation with an elderly man sitting on a wooden stool outside his hut. "Good morning, sir," he called, smiling. The man gave him a long, hard look before slowly turning away, refusing to speak. The group exchanged uneasy glances and continued walking. They came across a small market, where a few women were selling vegetables and dried fish. He noticed that one of the women was staring at him, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. He approached her, trying to be friendly. "Good morning, Ma. Do you know where we can find some bread or anything to eat?" he asked. The woman glanced around nervously before leaning in close. "You should leave Ajala, young man," she whispered, her voice trembling. There are things here that you do not understand. Leave before it is too late. He felt a chill run down his spine as the woman turned away, refusing to say anything more. He rejoined the group, his mind racing. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening in Ajala was not just in their imagination. Determined to find answers, the group decided to visit the village chief. They figured that if anyone knew what was happening in Ajala, it would be him. They made their way to his compound, a large, fenced area at the center of the village. 2 guards stood at the entrance, their faces expressionless as they blocked the gate. "We need to see the chief," Namdi said, his voice confident. The guards exchanged a glance before one of them disappeared inside to inform the chief of their arrival. After a few minutes, they were allowed inside and were led to a small hut where the chief sat on a low stool. He was an elderly man with deep wrinkles etched into his face, his eyes sharp and calculating. He looked at them, his gaze lingering on each of them before finally speaking. "You have come to my village for your youth service, yes," he said, his voice deep and gravelly. He nodded, stepping forward. "Yes, sir. But we've experienced some strange things since we got here. We just want to understand what's happening." The chief's expression remained unreadable as he listened. He sighed, shaking his head slowly. "Ajala is an old place, with old traditions. Some things are better left undisturbed. If you are wise, you will finish your service quietly and leave. Do not ask questions. Do not interfere." His words offered no comfort, only deepened the mystery. "But sir, we need to know if we're in danger," Chinedu pressed, his voice tense. The chief looked at him for a long moment before simply saying, "You are not in danger, as long as you follow the rules." He refused to say anything more, and the group left the compound feeling even more confused and anxious. Later that day, as they returned to the lodge, they saw a child standing by the entrance. The boy was small, his clothes dirty, and his face smeared with mud. He stood still, staring at them with wide, unblinking eyes. Sola smiled and approached him, crouching down to his level. "Hello there, what are you doing here?" he asked gently. The child said nothing, his gaze fixed on him. After a moment, he raised his arm and pointed towards the forest. He frowned, stepping closer. "What's over there?" he asked, but the child remained silent. Instead, he turned and began to walk towards the forest, his movements slow and deliberate. Namdi shook his head. "We shouldn't follow him. This feels off," he muttered. But curiosity got the better of his. "What if he knows something?" he said, starting to follow the boy. They trailed after the child, their footsteps cautious as they entered the forest. The air grew colder, and the thick canopy of leaves above them blocked out the sunlight. The boy moved deeper into the woods, and just when he was about to call out to him, the child stopped and pointed to a spot on the ground. It was a clearing, with strange symbols drawn in the dirt and a small pile of bones in the center. The group stood frozen, their eyes widening as they took in the sight. Suddenly, the child turned and ran back towards the village, disappearing among the trees. "We need to leave now," Sola whispered, her voice trembling. The others nodded, and they hurried back to the lodge, their hearts pounding with fear. Back at the lodge, the group tried to make sense of what they had seen in the forest. The symbols in the clearing had been drawn with precision, and the bones seemed to have been arranged deliberately. It looked like some kind of ritual, and the thought sent a shiver down Isa's spine. "What do you think it means?" Chinedu asked, his voice shaky. "It can't be good." "Maybe they are doing rituals here," Beo suggested, his face pale. Namdi, who had been skeptical from the beginning, now seemed visibly shaken. He rubbed his hands over his face, sighing. "We should have just minded our business," he said. "I think the chief was right, we need to finish our service quietly and leave." He nodded, but something inside him couldn't let it go. He had to know what was happening in Ajala, and why the villagers seemed so intent on keeping it a secret. He decided that night he would return to the clearing to investigate further. It was a risk, but he had to find answers, even if it meant putting himself in danger. As the others slept, he slipped out of the lodge, a flashlight in hand. He moved silently, careful not to wake anyone. The air was cold, and his breath formed small clouds in front of him as he made his way towards the forest. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and determination driving him forward. He reached the edge of the forest and hesitated for a moment, looking back towards the lodge. He knew this was dangerous, but he had to find out what was going on. He entered the forest, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The path was overgrown, and branches scratched at his arms and face as he moved. He kept his eyes focused on the ground, looking for any sign of the clearing the child had led them to earlier. Finally, he found it. The symbols were still there, and the pile of bones lay undisturbed. He crouched down, examining the symbols more closely. They were strange, intricate designs, and he couldn't understand their meaning. Suddenly, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned, his flashlight sweeping across the trees, but there was nothing there. He stood up slowly, his muscles tensed. The rustling grew louder, and Isa's heart raced. He took a step back, his mind screaming at him to run. Before he could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, thin man, his face covered in white paint, his eyes wide. The man stared at Is for a long moment before letting out a blood-curdling scream. Is turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he raced back towards the lodge, the screams echoing behind him. He didn't stop until he was safely inside, slamming the door shut and collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. The next morning, he told the others what had happened in the forest. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He described the symbols, the bones, and the man with the painted face. The room fell silent as they listened, the weight of his words sinking in. Nnamdi was the first to speak. "We need to leave. We can't stay here any longer." His voice was firm, his expression grim. Sola nodded, her eyes filled with fear. "We should have left when we had the chance. Now we know for sure that something terrible is happening here." Beo, who had always tried to keep everyone calm, now looked defeated. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "But where will we go? The coordinator said there's no relocation until after 3 months. We can't just leave without permission." He shook his head. "We have to try. We need to find a way out of Ajala, before it's too late." They all agreed that they would go to the secretariat again and demand relocation, even if they had to leave without the proper paperwork. Staying in Ajala was no longer an option, not after what they had seen. Is, Beo, Nnamdi, Sola, and Chinidu made their way back to the secretariat, their hearts heavy with fear and determination. They burst into the coordinator's office, demanding to be relocated immediately. The coordinator, who had been sitting behind his desk, looked up at them, his eyes narrowing. "What is going on?" he asked, his voice cold. He stepped forward, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here. There are strange things happening, people, rituals. We need to leave." The coordinator sighed, leaning back in his chair. He rubbed his temples, as if the group's panic was giving him a headache. "I've told you before, there are certain boundaries you need to respect here in Ajala. You've crossed those boundaries, and now you must deal with the consequences." His words sent a chill through the room, and the corpers exchanged nervous glances. "What do you mean?" Nnamdi asked, his voice filled with anger. "Are you saying you knew this was happening?" The coordinator stared at them for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, I knew. Ajala is not like other places. There are old customs here, and if you do not follow them, there are consequences. I cannot help you." He paused, his eyes locking on Isa's. "The only advice I can give you is to stay inside after dark, and avoid the cemetery at all costs. Do not interfere with the villagers, and you may survive until the end of your service." The group left the office, feeling more helpless than ever. It was clear they were on their own. The group returned to the lodge, their minds filled with the coordinator's cryptic warnings. They sat together in the common room, a heavy silence enveloping them. The reality of their situation was beginning to set in. They were trapped in Ajala, unable to leave, surrounded by villagers who seemed to be hiding something dark and sinister. Sola looked at the others, her eyes filled with tears. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Is took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "We follow his advice. We stay inside after dark, and we avoid the cemetery. We just need to make it through the next few months, and then we'll be out of here." But even as he said it, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. There was something in Ajala that seemed determined to keep them there, something that went beyond the strange customs and rituals. He could feel it, a dark presence lurking in the shadows, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Bill nodded, though his face remained pale. "We stick together. No one goes anywhere alone, especially after sunset. And we need to be careful about what we say and who we trust." The others agreed, and they decided to take shifts at night to keep watch. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. They couldn't rely on anyone but each other. 2 days later, Chinedu went missing. It happened in the early hours of the morning, before anyone else had woken up. Is had taken the first shift that night, keeping an eye on the surroundings from the window. He watched the shadows stretch across the courtyard, listening to the strange noises that drifted in from the forest. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary, but when the sun rose, Chinedu was gone. His bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded as if he had left of his own accord. The others searched the lodge, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Panic began to set in as they realized that their friend had simply vanished without a trace. Sola broke down, tears streaming down her face as she clung to Is. "Where is he? He wouldn't just leave," she cried, her voice filled with desperation. Namdi and Beo scoured the village, asking the locals if they had seen Chinedu, but the villagers either ignored them or shook their heads, their eyes filled with something akin to pity. The group's worst fears were becoming reality. Chinedu had become another victim of Ajola's dark curse. The realization left them feeling helpless, their confidence shattered. They returned to the lodge, their hearts heavy with grief, knowing that they were now fighting not only for their safety but for their very survival. After Chinedu's disappearance, the atmosphere in the lodge changed. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and inescapable. The remaining 4 corpers decided they needed a better plan if they were going to survive. They couldn't afford to let their guard down again, not after what happened to Chinedu. Namdi, who had always been the most confident among them, now wore a look of grim determination. "We need to do something," he said, his voice firm. Bale suggested they form a vigilante group of sorts, taking turns keeping watch over the lodge at night and even during the day. "We can't trust anyone here. The villagers know something, and they won't help us," he said, his voice filled with anger. "We need to take matters into our own hands." Sola nodded, her eyes still red from crying. "We need to stick together. We can't let anyone out of our sight." They divided the hours of the day and night into shifts, ensuring that at least one of them was always on guard. They also barricaded the doors and windows, using whatever they could find to reinforce the fragile locks. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. They had to be ready for anything. They had to survive. One night, as he kept watch by the window, he saw a figure moving towards the lodge. His heart pounded in his chest as he strained his eyes to see who it was. The figure was small, hunched over, and moved with an awkward gait. As it drew closer, he realized it was a child, the same child they had seen by the lodge earlier, the one who had led them into the forest. The boy approached the door, knocking softly. "By Jollof Rice," he said, his voice monotone. Isa's blood ran cold, the memory of that first night flashing through his mind. He turned to wake Namdi, who was sleeping nearby. "Namdi, wake up," he whispered urgently. Namdi stirred, his eyes blinking open in confusion. "What is it?" he asked, sitting up. "That boy, he's back," he said, pointing towards the door. Namdi frowned, standing up and approaching the window. He saw the child, still standing there, knocking softly. "By Jollof Rice," the boy repeated, his voice eerie and hollow. Namdi's face paled, and he turned to Is. "We can't open the door. We can't let him in. Is nodded, his hands trembling. They watched as the boy continued to knock, his eyes blank, his voice repeating the same phrase over and over. After what felt like an eternity, the boy turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Is and Nnamdi exchanged a glance, their faces pale with fear. It was clear that whatever was happening in Ajala was far from over, and they were now caught in the middle of something they couldn't understand. The next morning, Sola and Beo went to fetch water from the nearby stream, leaving Is and Nnamdi to clean up the lodge. As they walked, Is noticed something etched into the wall near the front door. It was a series of strange symbols, similar to the ones they had seen in the forest clearing. He felt his stomach drop, and he called out to Nnamdi. "Look at this," he said, pointing at the wall. Nnamdi frowned, stepping closer to examine the symbols. "It's the same as before," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Someone must have come here last night and carved this into the wall." He shook his head, a sense of dread washing over him. "But why? What does it mean?" he asked. Nnamdi didn't have an answer. When Sola and Beo returned, they gathered in the common room to discuss what they had found. Sola's face went pale as she looked at the symbols, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. "This is a warning," she whispered. "They're trying to scare us, or maybe they're marking us for something." The others exchanged uneasy glances, the fear growing stronger with each passing moment. They knew they had to be careful. Whatever was happening, it was getting closer, and they were running out of time. That night, Is had a strange dream. He found himself standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. A cold wind blew, rustling the leaves, and he felt an overwhelming sense of fear. He turned, and there, in the shadows, he saw a figure, a woman dressed in white, her hair loose and flowing. She raised her arm, pointing at him, her eyes wide and empty. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. "Leave, or you will never see the light again." He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. He felt his legs grow weak, and he fell to his knees, his eyes locked on the woman. She stepped closer, her face growing clearer. He could see now that her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and her mouth twisted into a grimace of pain. "Leave," she whispered again, her voice fading as the forest began to close in around him. He woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling. He looked around the room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The others were asleep, their breathing slow and even. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. It was just a dream, he told himself, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a warning, a message that if they didn't leave Ajala soon, they would all be doomed. Before I continue, this is a plea to you, my awesome viewers who haven't subscribed to my channel, to please be a part of my growth. I'm begging you click on that subscribe button please, and if you're a returning subscriber, hey, welcome back. I am so happy to have you here, thank you so much. Now let's go back to the story. The dream left Is with a renewed sense of urgency. He knew that if they stayed in Ajala any longer, they would all end up like Chinedu, disappearing without a trace, their fates unknown. He gathered the others in the morning, sharing his dream and his fears. Sola's face was pale, her eyes filled with tears. "We have to get out of here," she said, her voice breaking. "We can't stay. Not anymore." Nnamdi nodded, his expression grim. "We need to leave, with or without permission. We can't wait for the coordinator to give us the green light. We need to do this ourselves." Beo agreed, and they began to form a plan. They decided to leave in the dead of night, when the village was quiet, and the villagers were asleep. They would gather their things and head towards the path they had come in through, hoping that it would lead them to safety. They spent the day preparing, packing their bags with whatever they could carry. They knew it wouldn't be easy, there was no telling what awaited them in the forest, and the villagers might try to stop them. But they had no choice. They had to take the risk, or they would never leave Ajala alive. The day passed slowly, the sun inching across the sky as the Corpers prepared for their escape. Every noise made them jump, their nerves frayed from the fear of being discovered. As night fell, they gathered in the common room, their bags packed and ready. They sat in silence, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. He glanced at the others, his heart heavy. "We stick together, no matter what," he said, his voice low. "If anything happens, we don't split up." Sola nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We get out of here, or we die trying," she said, her voice trembling. They waited until the village grew silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. When they were sure everyone was asleep, they picked up their bags and quietly made their way to the door. Nnamdi slowly turned the key in the lock, his hands shaking. The door creaked open, and they stepped out into the cool night air. The village was dark, the only light coming from the moon above. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning their surroundings for any sign of danger. As they reached the edge of the village, they heard a noise behind them, a soft rustling sound, like someone following them. He stunned, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. He swallowed hard, his eyes locking on Nnamdi's. "Keep moving," he whispered, and they continued into the forest, the darkness closing in around them. The four corpers entered the forest, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves and undergrowth. The air was cold, and the towering trees cast long shadows in the moonlight, making it difficult to see. Nnamdi led the way, his flashlight flickering as they carefully navigated the path. They moved as quietly as they could, the tension palpable. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves and the distant howling of some nocturnal animal. Sola clung to his, her eyes darting around nervously. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made her heart race. Beo followed closely behind, glancing back every few steps, making sure they weren't being followed. He kept his eyes ahead, focusing on the path, trying to keep his fear at bay. They needed to stay calm, to think clearly if they were going to make it out of Ajala alive. Suddenly, they heard it, a sound that froze them in their tracks. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Nnamdi turned, shining his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there. The footsteps continued, growing louder, echoing through the forest. Sola's grip tightened on Isa's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to keep moving," Is whispered, his voice barely audible. They started walking again, faster this time, their hearts pounding. Whatever was following them wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The deeper they went into the forest, the thicker the trees became, their branches intertwining above to create a dark canopy. The group moved as quickly as they could, but the forest seemed endless. It was as if they were going in circles, with no way out. Then, up ahead, they saw a clearing. The moonlight shone down, illuminating the space, and he felt a strange sense of familiarity wash over him. He realized it was the same clearing the child had led them to before, the one with the strange symbols and the pile of bones. Nnamdi stopped, his eyes narrowing as he examined the clearing. "This place again," he muttered, his voice filled with frustration. Sola shivered, looking around. "I don't like this. It feels wrong," she whispered. Beo nodded, glancing over his shoulder. "We need to keep moving. We can't stay here," he said. As they began to leave the clearing, he noticed something, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the shadows. It was a woman, her white gown flowing in the breeze, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. She stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed on them. Isa's heart stopped, and he grabbed Nnamdi's arm. "Look," he whispered, pointing towards the figure. The others turned, their eyes widening in shock. The woman began to move towards them, her steps slow and deliberate. "Run!" Nnamdi shouted, and they all took off, sprinting through the forest, their hearts pounding in their chests. The woman's presence lingered behind them, her figure moving silently through the shadows as if gliding. They ran without looking back, desperate to escape the strange apparition. After running for what felt like hours, the group reached the river. It was narrow but deep, the water rushing over rocks, the sound filling the air. They stopped to catch their breath, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with fear. Nnamdi looked across the river, trying to determine if it was safe to cross. "We have to get to the other side," he said, his voice hoarse. "If we can cross the river, maybe we can lose her." Sola nodded, her face pale. "How do we cross?" she asked, her voice trembling. Is looked around, spotting a fallen tree lying across the river. It was old, its bark rough and covered in moss, but it looked sturdy enough. "We'll use that," he said, pointing towards the tree. One by one, they climbed onto the tree, carefully making their way across. The water rushed beneath them, the sound deafening, but they moved slowly, balancing themselves as they crossed. Sola was the last to go, her legs shaking as she stepped onto the tree. Halfway across, she lost her footing, slipping on the wet moss. She let out a small scream, her arms flailing, but Beo grabbed her just in time, pulling her back onto the log. "I've got you," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes were filled with fear. They made it to the other side, collapsing onto the ground, their bodies exhausted. They could hear the sound of footsteps on the other side of the river, but when they looked back, there was nothing there. The woman had disappeared. The four of them sat on the forest floor, trying to catch their breath. Their bodies ached, their legs felt like jelly, and their minds were racing. He leaned against the tree, his eyes closing for a moment as he tried to steady his breathing. Namdi looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice strained. "We can't rest here for too long." Sola shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. I need a moment," she whispered. Her hands were trembling, her face pale. Beo sat beside her, putting an arm around her shoulders. "We'll be okay. We just need to stay together," he said softly, trying to comfort her. He opened his eyes, glancing at the others. He knew they were all scared, more scared than they had ever been in their lives. But they couldn't give up now. They had come too far. "We rest for a few minutes, then we have to move again," he said, his voice steady. He looked at Sola, giving her an encouraging nod. "We can do this. We just need to stay strong." Sola wiped her tears, nodding. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the forest around them quiet, as if holding its breath. They knew they couldn't stay, but for a moment, they allowed themselves to rest, to gather their strength for whatever lay ahead. After resting for a while, the group decided to continue their journey. They moved cautiously, their senses heightened, their eyes scanning the forest for any sign of danger. As they walked, they began to hear something, a faint whispering, like the sound of many voices speaking at once. The whispers seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. He felt a chill run down his spine, and he glanced at Namdi. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Namdi nodded, his face tense. "Yeah, I hear it. We need to keep moving," he said, his eyes darting around. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping, speaking in a